Start the recording and also the transcription. Okay, I'm so excited to see everyone today. This is a good group, and I know we're expecting a few more too, but I'll stall for a minute as I introduce, and they all have time to come in. I'm excited today to introduce Dr. Erika Mosyjowski.
Mosyjowski.
Thank you. Sorry.
No, that's easy.
I think many of you in the audience already know her. She is a research fellow and lecturer in mechanical engineering now. Before this, she got her PhD from U of M in higher ed with our own Lisa Latuka. And she did a sociology and psychology bachelor's degree at Case Western as well. She studies cultural beliefs about engineering and engineers, as well as how we might help engineers to make better decisions that include both the social and contextual factors that are so important in engineering and sometimes don't get the attention that they should. And I will turn it over to you.
All right, thanks. Well, let me get my screen back sharing here properly. All right, good to go, hopefully. Well, thanks everybody for coming out. As Robin said, I'm Erika Mosyjowski, and I will be presenting a talk called Engineering for the Social Good, Understanding and Challenging Barriers to Socially Engaged or Socially Informed Engineering Practice. You know, as Robin mentioned, I'm currently housed within the mechanical engineering department here at U of M as a research fellow, but I am focused. My work is focused on engineering education specifically. I stumbled my way into engineering ed in 2011, working with Shanna Daly, and I've been involved in work in this space in some sense ever since, although my actual formal training is in social science and in higher education. Before going back for a PhD, I actually worked here in the College of Engineering in the Office of Student Affairs, and my experiences there were something else that further motivated me to want to better understand the engineering education context and the culture of engineering programs and how to better support students in their journeys. So broadly speaking, my interests relate to engineering culture and ideas about who engineers are and what they do, especially pushing on this, you know, on the extent to which engineers include or account for socially, culturally, contextually relevant aspects of the work as suggested by the title of the talk today. And then I'm also interested in engineers' academic and career decision making. So, what I'm going to discuss today generally is around the idea of kind of what constitutes engineering practice, something that's often traditionally framed in very narrowly technical terms, and then recognizing the need for greater attention to human and social and contextual considerations within engineering. I'm going to focus mainly on one project today, but then at the end, I'll talk briefly about two others that have some connections to this work. So the main project is focused on this question of how narrowly technical ideas of engineering work are reproduced. You know, focus first on characterizing what engineers perceive to be emphasized practices within different engineering settings in which they engage and how they experience those and are shaped by those emphases. And then at the end, the other two projects that I'll briefly touch on, one relates to exploring the implementation and impact of one approach to teaching socially engaged engineering skills, and the other relates to curricular messages about the nature of engineering work in core engineering courses and how those shape students' career thinking. So I'm particularly interested in the extent to which contextual aspects of engineering work are emphasized and are valued. And one of the main things that led me into this work is literature pointing out a neglect of contextual aspects of engineering and the consequences that might have for engineering students and practitioners. You know, there have been a number of high-level calls to broaden the focus of engineering work and to include context as something that's really critical for engineers to be able to adequately address the complex problems of the modern world. You know, I'm sure we've all seen those calls both nationally and here at U of M specifically. And I want to be clear that when I'm talking about context or contextual aspects, I'm using that term very broadly to include attention to social, cultural, political, economic, environmental, temporal contexts. So, despite the calls that we've seen, the kind of primacy of technical considerations seems to persist in engineering. And in part, it's because engineering is grounded in this long positivist legacy in which the field essentially stakes its legitimacy on the idea that technological advancement somehow can and should occur without any consideration for the cultural or the political or other contextual realities that shape or are affected by engineering work. And thus the field has been really slow to change. So I see two, at least, key consequences of neglecting social and contextual considerations in engineering. First, I think it can result in solutions that aren't useful to or even actively harm the people or the communities or environments that they're intended to benefit or are situated within. Certainly, there have been numerous case studies of this, and we even see it happening in international development engineering work, where one might assume or at least hope that engineers would be more aware of contextual considerations and engage deeply with stakeholders, but that's certainly not always the case of what's happening. I think it also has implications for who's attracted to the field of engineering and who persists. Engineers who care about contextual aspects of the work or how engineering might be used to benefit particular people or communities, they might struggle to identify with or feel that they belong in engineering spaces in which those values are ignored or rejected. And I think a neglect of those aspects is particularly concerning in light of research that suggests that contextually oriented engineering work actually attracts a broader, a more diverse body of engineers. So I really think it's at the peril of engineering and its future to neglect these contextual considerations. So I want to present kind of the overarching conceptual framing that informs or helps orient my thinking in this space. The first comes from Holland et al.'s work on figured worlds. And they define figured worlds as a socially and culturally constructed realm of interpretation in which particular characters and actors are recognized, significance is assigned to certain acts, and particular outcomes are valued over others. And within these figured worlds or these local contexts, they both shape and are shaped by the actions of those who are participating, who are engaging in those spaces. And within these spaces, there are dominant or most valued or most recognizable ways of being a certain kind of person or a member of that space that have implications for how individuals' actions are interpreted by others within that space. And then the second very closely related framework that helps to orient my thinking comes from Holland, who then teamed up with Jean Lave to elaborate on a shared version of social practice theory. And this social practice theory emphasizes how widespread cultural phenomena, like, for example, narrowly technical ideas about engineering work, and then individuals' varied personal experiences and values that they bring with them are negotiated through what they refer to as contentious practice within local settings. And here contentious comes from the fact that there's an inherent tension in negotiating meaning or what's important in a given space, and that people stand to risk their own version of practice being dismissed or devalued based on how it's perceived with or aligns with others in those spaces. So these are very high level frameworks, but I think they're useful in grounding our thinking about the relationship between cultural values in given settings, like, for example, beliefs about important aspects of engineering work, and then the actions or practice of folks within those spaces, and how people view and position themselves and others within those spaces, and the potential consequences of when there is a tension between certain cultural values and individuals' own behavior or values. So focusing on the details of this first study that I'm going to talk about now, have a couple of kind of core research questions. The overarching goal of that work was to understand how an underemphasis on social and contextual aspects of engineering work, how is it perpetuated? Why does it persist? And how is that emphasis experienced then by engineering students and practitioners? And it had kind of three sub questions or studies within this. The first looking at what practices participants perceive to be most emphasized and how those align with their personal values or priorities. The second relating to the kinds of factors or considerations that the participants accounted for in describing their own work solving engineering problems, and the types of experiences or training that they cited as shaping their thinking in those areas and in their ability to attend to those factors. And then the third piece is thinking about how individuals, putting these pieces together, how individuals navigate dominant forms of engineering work in the different settings in which they engage, as well as their own values and how that shapes their practice and their perceptions of engineering. So just a quick overview of my participants. So I'll speak more about both in a minute, but I had two interviews that I'm drawing on. And in the first interviews, they included 46 different participants. Within that group, I intentionally sought to recruit a diverse pool of participants on a number of different aspects related to engineering, as well as to their personal backgrounds, including the level of experience. So everything from early undergraduate students to advanced professionals with 40 or 50 years of engineering experience across different engineering subfields. And then also recruited based on gender and race and ethnicity. I just want to note that this sample was slightly more diverse than the engineering field as a whole in terms of gender and racial composition. And then for my second interviews, I recruited a subset of this original 46 and spoke with 18 of those participants for second interviews. So the first interview with the 46 participants, this was a semi-structured interview around 60 to 90 minutes in length. And this interview focused a lot on talking through engineers' experiences, their lived experiences solving a complex engineering problem. And that was defined pretty broadly in order to be inclusive of engineers with lots of different types and levels of experience. But talking through, what that process was for them, and the types of things that they considered, and then how that compared to their engineering experiences more generally, and also asking them to reflect a bit on their engineering journey and experiences more broadly. Then in the second interview, those were card sort interviews with a subset of 18 total participants, and those lasted about 45 minutes each. And what a card sort interview entailed was, back in the days of in-person interviewing, I had a physical deck of index cards with 26 different engineering practices written on them. And I asked participants to engage in a series of sorts throughout the interview. I asked them about 2 different contexts for each participant, and I asked them to sort through these 26 cards and identify the 5 practices-ish that they considered to be, or they perceived to be, most emphasized in the 2 different settings I talked about. And then a similar sort for the ones that were least emphasized in these different settings. And then after walking through this for each setting for participants, asking them to reflect on those practices that they personally considered to be the most important. So before I move on to findings, I do just want to note a couple limitations of the study. So, first, there were a wide range of settings represented in the study, which was really helpful to understand a range of experiences as kind of a first look, but it's hard to be sure how those findings might hold up or transfer to one particular engineering setting or field. I think that's true, especially for the engineering workplaces that were represented in my study. There were just fewer number of those and a huge variation in kind of what that work looked like and the focus of that work. So, secondly, when asking engineers to talk through what they considered, we really only focused on a single engineering problem. So that's unlikely to capture all aspects of engineering work that engineers would potentially consider. That's likely different for different problems. Although I did ask participants to reflect on their experiences and priorities more broadly too, but still more work would be needed in that space. So what did I learn? All right, so looking at this first set of analyses around the question of the practices that participants perceived to be most emphasized and how that aligned with their personal values and priorities. So the first kind of sub-analysis for this was really just summarizing, based on this card sort data of 18 participants, what practices they perceived to be most emphasized, least emphasized in different engineering settings. I broke it down by undergraduate settings, graduate settings, and professional engineering work, as well as those practices that they commonly identified as most personally prioritized. Then I also categorized each participant based on their personal emphases of contextual aspects of engineering work and the degree of dissonance that they expressed between their personal priorities and the emphasis of the different engineering contexts in which they engaged. So, I have a big complex table to summarize, this first kind of piece of the card sort data about the aspects that engineers identified as kind of most and least prioritized across different settings. But for the sake of time, I'm not going to go into that too much. I'll just provide kind of a highlight of some key findings, especially around the social and contextual considerations, though I'm happy to share if anyone has questions later. So, first in thinking about the aspects that engineers commonly identified, and when I say commonly, I mean about a third or more of participants identified as something that they considered personally most important. Those practices included things like accounting for potential future impacts in developing a solution, considering ethical responsibility, accounting for the social or cultural context. Interestingly, accounting for the social or cultural context was also one of the most commonly named by a third or more participants, responding to as something that was among the least emphasized in both undergrad, grad, and professional engineering contexts. Although notably, another third of participants also identified it as among the things that was most emphasized in professional work contexts. So really highlighting the range of work contexts that we did see in the study. Other broader contextual considerations were also among things that participants commonly identified as among the least emphasized in different contexts that they engaged. So things like accounting for the natural environment among graduate and professional engineering settings, and incorporating ideas and approaches from other fields for students in undergrad and grad settings, and accounting for future potential impacts in grad settings. So next, using the same card sort data, but focusing more holistically on the conversations and reflections that were elicited from this card sort interview, I categorized participants into one of 9 sections of this figure, based on the extent to which they personally prioritize social and contextual factors and the degree of dissonance that they expressed. And here, dissonance basically refers to some sort of tension or disconnect between the aspects of engineering work that they perceive to be emphasized in the different engineering settings that they engaged in, and then what an individual personally thinks is important or should be more or less emphasized. So starting here in this first quadrant, or nonet actually, we have Nelson. And Nelson personally, he was a 4th year undergraduate student, highly involved in the student project team, and he placed a low degree of prioritization on social and contextual factors personally, but also described really minimal dissonance. He mentioned that those things were not highly emphasized in his courses or his project team experiences, but that wasn't a bad thing in his eyes. He said, I think things that aren't really emphasized, like a lot of the social, the ethical responsibility, social awareness, future impacts, like they're not emphasized, but I don't really think a project team is the place to emphasize them. And he said similar things about his coursework. So then we have Paris, and Paris was a 1st year student, and she talked a lot about her experiences in her 1st year introduction to engineering class. And she expressed some moderate degree of dissonance or frustration about the emphases of that class, because the course spent one class session, which to her was a lot, on the importance of accounting for the social and contextual context. She thought that was too constraining. So Paris shared, I do feel like some of the things have been overemphasized. For example, I understand the social and cultural context, but I feel like it was emphasized too much, as it made us feel more constrained into a specific thought because we had to consider everyone's well-being. So then on the other end of the spectrum here, we have Alvin. And Alvin was a PhD student with a public health background. And he expressed some frustration. He cared deeply about social and contextual factors and was frustrated with what he perceived to be a narrow technical focus of engineering more broadly and in his personal experiences, and explained that while in his PhD work, he was able to focus on those things. It was largely self-driven. He said, I think they're there, but largely it's because I want them to be there. So I'm bringing them in and I'm driving them. I think someone could easily get through an IOE PhD without thinking of the social or cultural context of the work that they're doing. So then we have Eric. Eric was an environmental PhD student, and like Alvin, he placed a high degree of prioritization on social or contextual aspects of engineering work and described a high degree of dissonance in his work. He was really passionate as an environmental engineering PhD student about environmental justice. And he explained that while environmental considerations were of course considered in his training, he expressed a lot of frustration about the neglect of most other contextual aspects throughout his experiences in the field. And so he said, engineering gives the impression that as an engineer, all you need to care about is making sure that your design works, but it doesn't matter what the impact of that design is. So here's the rest of the figure filled in. I want to highlight first that the majority of participants expressed at least some degree of dissonance between what they personally prioritized and what the focus of the field was. And I also want to note that there was no one who was categorized into the kind of low prioritization of social and contextual factors, but high dissonance box. So here is the same figure, but I've added sources of dissonance. And just to note, the little up arrows in the figure indicate a desire for greater emphasis on. So what I want to point out here is that the majority of folks who did describe some dissonance cited a desire for more emphasis on social and or contextual aspects of engineering practice in their work or in their school settings. So moving on to the second set of analyses, looking at the factors that participants considered in their own engineering practice and the experiences and training that they cited as shaping that. So for that, I looked at data from the first interview, and myself, along with a team of researchers, coded these first 46 interviews where participants were talking about their experiences solving complex problems, to mention, to understand what kinds of things they named as considering along the way. And then we grouped these factors into 6 bigger categories relating to kind of technical dimensions, to immediate conditions and constraints related to the problem, to stakeholders, to things related to kind of team coordination to address the problem, interrelationships between different components, and then this contextual category. So first, I kind of summarized counts and characterized what people's responses looked like related to each factor, who was commonly naming what. And then similarly, I described and summarized what participants named as previous experiences that they had had as influential in what they attended to or how they attended to these various factors or various aspects of engineering. So again, here I'm going to skip the big tables, but just highlight a couple key findings. So in terms of what engineers described accounting for, it's not surprising that technical dimensions were the most commonly, by nearly all engineers, something that they described in depth accounting for. And then the second most commonly identified thing was relating to kind of the immediate conditions around the problem, like the material resources that were available to them, or the timeline, or the conditions in which it might be deployed, things like temperature, for example. And then, contextual factors, things like the environment, the political context, the social and cultural context were by far the least commonly named thing that engineers described accounting for. By I think far fewer than even a quarter of participants talked about these factors at all. And then thinking about what types of experiences engineers named as influential, as shaping their awareness or attention to these different types of factors. So of course the majority can name specific experiences that shaped their consideration of different technical factors, but very, very few described any experiences related to or that informed their thinking around contextual considerations. And notably, of those participants who did name some experience that was shaping their thinking about contextual dimensions, almost none named any kind of workplace or formal coursework as a source of that. They're much more likely to talk about how personal experiences or co-curricular experience was something that was driving their awareness or thinking about these cultural or contextual dimensions. And I think these findings are important because in addition to seeing that participants generally perceived social and contextual aspects of engineering to be not valued in most of the engineering spaces in which they engage, this data also suggests that they weren't having a lot of experiences with or chances to develop skills in these areas. And I think then that's something that's reflected in what they then actually attend to in their own engineering practice, and the cycle continues. So then moving on to the third set of analyses here, looking at putting the pieces together about how engineers negotiate their personal values and prioritize aspects of engineering in the different contexts that they engage in, and how that relates to their practice and perceptions of engineering. So for this phase, I did case studies of 4 different participants, 2 who were classified as highly prioritizing contextual aspects, and 2 on the other end of the spectrum who place a low degree of personal consideration on contextual aspects of engineering. And within those, I selected 1 student and 1 professional on either end of the spectrum. And for that, I pulled data from both interviews related to anything related to the dominant values that these engineers perceived in their different engineering settings they engaged in, how their experiences shaped their work and what they intended to, and how they felt about engineering and their place within it. So again, I'm just going to give a big picture overview of each case, although they're all really fascinating and I would love to elaborate. But first we have Nelson. And I'd mentioned him previously, but Nelson was a 4th-year undergraduate student really involved in an aerospace project team. And Nelson, he didn't really prioritize contextual aspects in his work. That wasn't something that was personally very important to him. But he was generally pretty content with the theoretical and technical focus of his courses and his teams. And then in talking about the types of things that he then actually engaged in addressing a problem specific to his project team experience, he talked mostly in depth about the technical considerations, as well as the team dynamics, and explicitly rejected any relevance of contextual factors in that space. He described it as, we're just a bunch of college students building I'm going to not name exactly what it was to not identify him, but he explained then that some students use their skills from that project to go into missile development and such when asked, but that was something that they explicitly did not discuss on that team. And then Nelson, he was a team leader on that team in various capacities, and so had some substantial sway over kind of what the work on that team looked like. Then we have Alec. Alec was an experienced engineer. He was talking about his experiences, especially at a biomedical related startup. Unlike Nelson, Alec placed a high degree of prioritization on technical aspects of engineering, as well as on teamwork and communication, but again, explicitly not on contextual dimensions. When he was reflecting on his undergrad experience, Alec expressed some frustration with what he saw as a theoretical focus of the work, that it wasn't sufficiently hands-on. But that he was quite happy with the focus of his current work, and indeed because he was a co-founder of his company, so he has some significant sway over what that looked like. But he explained that despite working in this kind of medical adjacent related field, he really didn't see these social or contextual dimensions as relevant. He said they tended to fall outside the scope of what his team considered. So then we have Emerson. Emerson was a 2nd-year undergraduate student who talked a lot about his experiences in an introduction to engineering course project. So for Emerson, social and contextual aspects were really important to him. He entered engineering with a desire to change the world. He explained that was his motivation for entering the field, and perceived within his courses to date that context was really underemphasized. But he was hopeful that, by the time he got to his upper level courses, perhaps he would see more of that in those courses. And he described seeking out other opportunities to kind of explore those contextual aspects and make those connections that were important to him. Emerson, in talking about kind of what he was able to address and attend to in his course project, he described feeling a bit constrained by the course structure in terms of timing and kind of how things were scored and just what was emphasized. And as I mentioned, he sought out other opportunities to engage in aspects important to him. And then last we have Leah, and Leah was an early career engineer who worked in the tool related industry. And like Emerson, Leah placed a high degree of emphasis on contextual and social dimensions of engineering, and similarly explained that she entered the field to have a positive impact. She expressed some frustration with the narrow technological focus, both of her undergraduate studies and of her professional engineering work, and talked about an undergrad seeking out other opportunities, sometimes outside of field of engineering formally, to engage in these things that she cared about, and kind of a more contextual focus, and talked about within the workplace context meeting some resistance when she was advocating for consideration of these social or contextual factors, and that the leaders in that workplace preferred to leave unexamined their assumptions about how and by whom the tools that they worked on might be used. And ultimately, in part because of that frustration or that tension, she explained that she had decided to leave that industry to pursue a grad study that she hoped might be a better fit. So there's just a few things I want to highlight from these cases. First, all 4 participants described seeking out activities outside of their core courses to fully engage in engineering work that was important to them. They felt differently about it, but all of them acknowledged the kind of primarily theoretical and technical emphasis of their coursework. But I think it's important to highlight the nature or extent to which they felt a disconnect, and consequences of that looked really different. So for Nelson, he perceived very little dissonance or disconnect. He was pretty happy in general with the emphasis of the field. Alec expressed some dissonance around what his undergrad curriculum mentioned, related to it not being sufficiently hands-on, but he talked about that more in relation to wanting to develop particular professional skills, but not as something that necessarily he thought had consequences for his sense of self or place in the field. In contrast, Leah described feeling like she couldn't bring her full self into these spaces, and really expressed a strong desire to integrate in these. And one thing that I want to stress here is that both Emerson and Leah expressed really a passion for the technical dimensions and the challenges of engineering work and of the job, that was an appeal, but they just wanted that in addition to consideration for this broader context. So what does this all mean? Let's make some sense of this. First, this question of how is this underemphasis on context perpetuated in engineering? My findings very much echo existing literature that points to this underemphasis on contextual aspects of the field, and I wanted to understand how those ideas were reproduced. So based on my findings, I argue that one way this underemphasis is reproduced is through practice in local engineering contexts. What folks are doing in their day-to-day, what they're tasked with and to attend to in their day-to-day. That shapes their kind of understandings, lived understandings of what engineering is. And that's why I think in part that top-down calls for change are largely ineffective. I think social practice theory highlights how local contexts have these shared values and meanings that shape for people acting in them what it means to be a member of that particular community, or a certain type of person, what it means to be an engineer. Which is very much, and so if contextual aspects aren't valued or encouraged within those local settings, which is very much the perception of participants who are in this study, then I think engineers are disincentivized to attend to those aspects. So, as my findings support, individuals who are studying or who are working in these contexts are likely to emphasize the aspects of engineering practice that are most valued in those settings in their own work. and not encouraged to broaden that. So I think that raises the question of can engineering work look different? Is change possible? So one thing that I want to note first is that there were some engineering settings in which participants perceived contextual aspects to be valued and emphasized. However, participants very much saw those as an exception to the rule. And I think that suggests that one experience, even an important experience, might not be sufficient to counteract the majority of the messaging or of their experiences in terms of what's perceived to be dominant forms of engineering work. So, I think one potential mechanism for change, as social practice theory points out, is, individuals bring with them into these different engineering settings their personal values and prior experiences from a range of settings, whether engineering or not, and they bring that to bear on their practice in these different settings. And I saw this in my data where engineers were drawing on experiences from their personal lives or from other engineering settings to inform their work on a project, and they're thinking about that. But I think acting alone, any change as a result of this is likely to be incremental at best. I think widespread change would require having many more engineers having experiences that stress the importance of attending to contextual aspects and having a chance to develop relevant skills, some sort of critical mass around this, or some common foundation or training in these spaces. So I think another piece that was important to me is understanding how what's emphasized in engineering shapes engineers' experiences. First of all, the majority of participants expressed some degree of dissonance between their personal priorities and the focus of the engineering settings that they were engaging in. Literature suggests that disconnects like this can affect engineers' feelings of fit, their happiness, their identification with the field, and even their persistence in the field. I'd argue that those whose practice aligns well with dominant values of these different settings may be more likely to be recognized or rewarded in their school or in their work settings. Some of the individuals who expressed dissonance around what was personally important to them described seeking out other opportunities that they could explore those values more. Others sought out those opportunities, but also made choices to spend less time in or even leave entirely certain engineering settings where they felt this disconnect. And then a final possibility is that some engineers may refer or may develop what Holland and Lave refer to as alternative subjectivities, essentially redefining what it means for themselves to be an engineer in a way that's consistent with their own values, but not necessarily with the dominant values of the field. And so we saw this in Emerson's case, for example. Emerson really valued social and contextual aspects of engineering and acknowledged that his peers really didn't. But rather than doubting his own priorities or his sense of fit within the field, he just expressed hope that his peers might come around and might learn the importance of the contextual aspects of engineering eventually. So, I think this work raises a number of implications. I'm just going to briefly highlight a few. First, since all engineers are exposed to engineering education, and very few engineers in this study described any experiences related to an emphasis on contextual aspects in their courses, I think it's important to take a closer look at curricular messaging related to kind of what counts in engineering. Relatedly, in practice, if we want to integrate contextual considerations into the curriculum, we need to provide training for faculty and instructors on how to do this, since many also likely lack the information and the resources necessary for integrating these kind of considerations into their courses. And finally, while my research kind of touched on this, on how misalignment between personal values and kind of dominant values shaped engineers' sense of their fit in the field, and a little bit about the career thinking, I think more work is needed in this area to really understand kind of the career implications of these potential disconnects. So these implications, I prepared these for a previous presentation, but they actually led really nicely into some of the projects that I'm currently working on. So one of those projects is about 1.5 years underway, and the other one's only about 4 months in. So I'm also going to just describe the work of those projects and share some preliminary considerations from the one. So the first project, I'm working on a grant led by Shanna Daly, along with Steve Skurlos and Colleen Seifert, in collaboration with the folks at the Center for Socially Engaged Design, like Anne Verhey-Henke and Charlie Michaels. On this grant, I also work with some great graduate research assistants, Liz Pollock and Kelly Dugan, and Robert Loweth also helped with data collection. And this grant is understanding the kind of impact and implementation of some of CSED's curriculum. So just to give an idea in their own words about what CSED is all about, they describe socially engaged design as humanity-centered, not just user-centered. You consider broad context through an equity-centered lens that impact the practice of engineering, including social, cultural, political, economic, and environmental factors that can completely change the design of solutions. Further, we push designers to analyze how their own identities and cultural context shape their approach. So we are studying the effects of CSED trainings, which include a huge library of resources and lessons on different topics pertaining to socially engaged engineering. And we're looking at those used in a classroom context in particular in this study. So that might take the form of virtual self-directed modules on a number of topics that also include feedback and application opportunities, or they may be expert facilitated lessons and trainings that tie into course topics. But with that, we want to better understand the implementation of those trainings. How are they working for instructors and students, and what's encouraging the use of these trainings, and what does student learning look like as a result? So this study involves a number of components. One of the first phases is interviews with kind of early adopter faculty who are using these CSED resources in their classes, and understanding what's motivating their use and how things are going, and as well as getting feedback from students who are participating in their courses and understanding the student experiences of that. And then a second phase that we're starting now is looking at students' experiences and how the way they talk about design, and especially about socially engaged aspects of engineering, changes from the beginning to end of a semester, using a scenario-based kind of pre-post interview for students. And then eventually is hoping to understand, what are the experiences of implementing some of the CSED curriculum in other settings, both at U of M and at other institutions. So I want to just share a couple preliminary findings from interviews with some of the early adopter instructors and students in their courses. So first, thinking about some of the things that faculty named as motivating their use of the CSED curriculum, one of the things for them was the extent to which it was easy to implement for them, that it either reduced their own effort in preparing their class, or at least didn't add to it in a really cumbersome way. And they also talked about the importance of how it aligned with their own course goals, and kind of the levels of their students, and as well as the ability and support around being able to tailor the materials in a way that really connected with the focus of their individual courses. Instructors also talked about some of the needs that they had in order to do this effectively, in order to integrate these effectively. They talked about if considering independent instruction around socially engaged engineering topics, that they needed resources or support and training in how to do that. Or some instructors expressed a desire to just consistently have some kind of external facilitator or partner who helped make that case and integrate that within their course. Other instructors talked about wanting more strategies for how to integrate existing course content with the CSED training topics, whether that be the templates or some other guide of how to integrate the two. And then thinking about what students had to say in response to this, I think students really varied in the extent to which they were able to apply some of the CSED trainings in the projects in the courses that we spoke with them. And I think one part of that was related to timing. So some of the students we talked to in their fourth year of, in their capstone, talked about that being the first time that they really had any exposure to some of the topics on socially engaged engineering. And so, depending on when that came in the semester, that could be a challenge for them to fully integrate into their course plans. Coming off a year of virtual instruction, students also had mixed feelings of modality when it was more of the virtual and self-directed learning block model. Some students really liked the flexibility that offered, but other students expressed a desire for more opportunities to engage with their instructors and their peers around these topics. One promising finding, though, that I'll end with there, is that almost across the board, students generally perceived the different topics of, related to socially engaged design that they learned about in their courses as relevant to their future engineering work. So thinking about then the third study, this is the one that's about 4 months in. So I'm just going to give an overview. So this study actually directly builds on findings from the main project that I discussed today to take a more focused look at the engineering education context. It's called, characterizing the nature of engineering work. And this study team is led by Shanna Daly, Joy Mondisa, and Lisa Lachuca, also joined by some great grad students, Sarah Jane Bork and Shannon Clancy, and higher ed master's students, Alex Cabrera and Kaylee Mers. So for this project, we're looking at 2 departments, mechanical engineering and industrial operations engineering, as a case study. And we're really focused on the curricular messaging in core courses within these 2 departments. What are students hearing about what counts in engineering? What does it mean to be a good mechanical engineer or an IOE engineer? What does that look like? What do they do? And our study approach is multi-method. It involves student interviews, observations of the different classes to learn and hear what kinds of messages are being sent, instructor interviews about what they intend to convey with their classes and their strategies for conveying that, as well as student surveys about what they perceive to be emphasized in their different courses and how that aligns with their personal values. So we're currently launching our first phase of student interviews, and those are focused on students' perceptions of the messaging in their core courses in engineering, and the extent to which that aligns with their own values and what they think is important. Are things do they perceive things to be overemphasized or underemphasized, and how that aligns with or shapes or supports their own career plans. So we're looking forward to digging into the data for that and then moving into integrating these other pieces starting next year. So just to conclude, I think the question of how to better prepare engineers to account for human and contextual aspects of engineering is a big one. And I think it can and needs to be approached from a number of directions. So I hope that the studies I mentioned today contribute to that work in a couple different ways. First, I think we need to understand how change happens or why it doesn't. How do engineers come to understand what is engineering? What's it all about? We also need to understand what's currently going on. What are students learning and how does that affect their understandings of their place within the field and their interest in engaging in that work? I think it's especially important to look at core undergraduate courses as some kind of a shared experience or common source of understanding for all engineers. A deep understanding of local context like classrooms, I think is key. It's a main place that students interact, that they develop shared understandings and definitions, and that they engage in engineering practice. And I define practice, to mean engaging in some kind of engineering work or application or demonstration of knowledge. So I think hearing those messages and engaging in practice within engineering courses, and especially led by their engineering instructors, I think is really important because it sends a strong message about what is core to engineering in a way that relying on extracurriculars or breadth requirements that students go outside of the College of Engineering doesn't achieve. And then I think we need to think about strategies for change and that take these local contexts into account, as well as take the mechanisms for change into account, to try things and to learn from them. I think we can learn from other instructors about successful strategies for integrating human and contextual aspects into engineering and begin to build some critical mass that would be needed to kind of shift the norms around what engineers do and who they are. So that is all I have. I'm going to stop sharing and any questions?
You all can put questions in the chat or in the Q&A. I will echo Laura's comment in the chat that this was amazing, and also Erika, I don't know if you saw, there was a Q&A question about where this would be posted, so I just answered that one, and I'll say to
great.
Erika and everyone that this will be up on the EER YouTube, but it might take about 24 hours to get there.
Great, thanks. Corey, I forgot that you were from Case. Oh, that's cool. I have a dissertation with the dissonance versus values figure, Laura. I still need to work on publishing this data. Oh, no, wait, I do. I think I do in an ASCE conference paper too. I'm happy to take any questions that either show up. I think I can properly monitor the chat and Q&A now that I can't when I screen share.
I think someone has their hand up.
Oh, okay.
And I'm trying to figure out how to see who it is so I can allow them to talk. I have found it.
Oh, great.
Saj, you should be able to talk now, I think.
Hello.
Hi.
I was just wondering how you went from the first group of students to the second, like there's a subset, and did you choose who to interview the next time?
Sure. It, in part was just natural attrition. I think we wanted to recruit folks with a range of backgrounds and experiences. So tried to attend to getting some diversity that way, among the same dimensions that I identified. I also, because I was really focused on engineering education specifically, talked mostly to people who had more recent experiences with some form of engineering education who weren't necessarily 50 years out, just so that they could reflect with more detail on their educational experiences as well. And then just folks agreeing to be interviewed again and who are available to participate.
All right, that's really cool, because I was wondering like what the methodological part was. And the other part is, have you ever, like, has a student ever said like, oh, we spend so much time on like math or physics and that's completely not relevant, and they would like rather swap out stuff?
I think it's that students feel that those pieces aren't relevant. Generally, if students were providing feedback, it wasn't that it was too much of the technical pieces. They were drawn to those, but that they really thought that was important to have in addition to an emphasis on some of the contextual aspects. For the students who felt that, again, that was not a universal perspective.
Got it. Thank you. This is a great talk. Really enjoyed it.
Your questions. Okay, I see a couple more in the chat. The first, I'm curious about any connections between incorporating social dimensions into engineering education, students' psychological health and sense of meaning. I think that's a great question that I can't answer definitively based on the data in this study. I think some students, in talking about dissonance, that was at least some form of frustration for students that they talked about. For some students, when those things weren't being centered in their engineering trainings in different ways, if it was important to them. But I would love to see future work that does a deeper dive into specifically kind of the psychological impacts of that. That's a really good question. Okay, let's see. I see how insufficient extracurriculars can be. Can you say more about how you understand the cost of relegating social and contextual consideration to only extracurricular engineering work? Yeah, Laura, that's a great question too. I think that's a problem for a couple of reasons. I mean, first of all, not saying that extracurriculars are not something that can be really a rich, wonderful, part of students' education. I think they absolutely are really key. But I think that not all students have equal access to participating in extracurricular activities. Non-traditional students who need to work to support themselves might not have the time or ability, or students who are commuting to engage as deeply in extracurricular engineering trainings. And so if we rely on those as kind of the only or the main place that that students are getting those pieces, I think then that's not ensuring that everyone has the ability to do that. And I think that one of the really powerful pieces of extracurriculars, often, they tend to be somewhat student directed. And while I think that's great, it also means there's a huge variation in kind of what is taught and what students learn as a result of engaging in those, that can vary widely from project to project. So I think, certainly I see those as a really rich place for students to continue to build on various engineering skills, but having all the pieces that, are necessary and important for engineering training centered also in the core courses that's common to all students, I think is also really important. So I see, okay, I mentioned the Figured Worlds framework, which involves not only learning about certain behaviors, attitudes, et cetera, but also the reproduction of those values, behaviors. Do you have any data on the environment that creates that figured world of engineering? For example, data on how the professors themselves not only produce, but reproduce these discourses. I'm guessing that is also what influences whether or not the students value discourses while disregarding others. Yeah, absolutely. So, a lot about what I was trying to understand, especially through the card sort interviews, in terms of what students perceive to be emphasized in these fields, and also asking how they came to that understanding about what was emphasized. A huge thing that many of the participants named was what was emphasized in their coursework, by their instructors, or what was given space in the classes or not. So I think that's something we're especially interested in understanding more in the next study, with thinking about this nature of engineering work and the curricular messaging within these core courses, is to understand more both about the perspectives of the instructors themselves, about what they're hoping to communicate in their courses, and what they believe is core, because I think that's really important to engage faculty with where they're at and what their own goals are, and to start from a deep understanding of that and what they're trying to do. And also to understand, then how is that received by students? Is it aligning always with what instructors are hoping to communicate? Are there disconnects? Things like that. So yeah, I mean, I certainly think, faculty play a big role in shaping students' understandings of kind of what counts as engineering work. And that certainly came up in the data for this past study, and hopefully we'll learn more going forward too.